So Professor Anton has just posted another great video. This time he was talking about agency and the way in which agency at the biological level in the organizational hierarchy of nature becomes possible, and that below the biological level there is no agency. There's only, as he described it, sort of geometrical tumbling, gravitational attraction, mass, and uh, length, width, and height, and so on. Before you get to living organisms, from Corey's perspective, you only have extension, a sort of bare existence, a sort of what Alfred North Whitehead would call a vacuous actuality, an actuality with no mixture of potentiality. In other words, in order to have agency, as you do at the biological level, you need to have potentiality. And potentiality has to do with being present to one's own past and one's own future in such a way that choice or some degree of freedom becomes possible. In other words, agency has to do with being able to not only inherit one's past, but to reflect upon one's inheritance, such that a field of possibilities opens up before one, allowing for multiple paths of realization in any given moment of experience. So I think the I see what Corey is doing here as a kind of defensive maneuver. What he's ultimately doing, I think, is critiquing that sort of deterministic materialism, or it could also be a critique of a sort of libertarian in the metaphysical, not the political sense, a libertarian theism, a fundamentalist libertarianism um, that would have to do with what Corey perceives to be some forms of um, death-denying religion. So these are the two metaphysical dogmatisms, materialism and sort of theism, that Corey is critiquing and responding to. And to the extent that he's trying to um, pull the rug from beneath these two extreme positions, I am in full agreement with Corey. And I certainly agree with everything he says about the biological realm. The only place I'd want to, I guess, really just extend what Corey is saying as regards the entrance of potentiality into actuality when life emerges from non-life, so-called. I'd want to extend this category of life to the entirety of the universe. Now, right off the bat, many people who are of a more materialistic leaning, or even perhaps people like Corey, who really want to respect as an ontological difference this boundary between non-life and life, the inorganic and the organic. Both of these camps are going to respond to what I just said, the desire to extend the category of life to the entire universe. They're going to say, oh, well, that's just some kind of a vitalism, or you're trying to say that rocks are alive or something, and it seems absurd and unjustified on the face of it. Now, um, I don't so much have a problem with the label vitalist or vitalism for my philosophy. I do think that the universe is alive in some significant sense, and I don't think it's a meaningless extension of the term life to talk about the universe itself as alive. I think, for the Greeks, life had to do uh, with soul or psyche or psyche. Um, the soul was the principle of life. It's what gave the sort of um, capacity for movement to living creatures. Of course, for Plato and even Aristotle, what we call matter was pure potential, and you know, um, this pure potential, this material substance, didn't take on definite character until it entered into actuality, into form, or shape, or morphe, morphology, and so on. And so the Greeks had a conception of soul as having to do with the form element. So soul is what allows potentiality to exist, to become actual, and not only to become actual, but to become actual for a reason, for a purpose. Soul is a kind of cause, a kind of final cause. So, thinking in this sort of broadly Aristotelian way, broadly enough that it's also a Platonic sort of way of thinking, we can say that the universe is alive, and by that we mean that the universe has a purpose, has a telos. There is a teleological tendency at the heart of all things. Now, right, so I'm trying to really unpack what I mean when I say that the universe is alive. I mean that the universe is best characterized, though, like all characterizations, it's limited. It's meant to be pragmatic, right? But we can say that the universe is alive and get closer to what's actually going on than if we said that the universe is just a machine, um, or if we said that the universe is just a sort of random assemblage of parts that purposelessly collide with one another, and through sheer accident have given rise to what we think is order, but really is just a temporary illusion of order. Um, Ultimately, the most metaphysical, in the sense of the most ultimate of all the physical laws of contemporary science, is entropy. Um, and in the late 20th century, especially, the notion of complexity has also entered the scene, and is quickly becoming just as ultimate. But for most uh, of modern science, since the scientific revolution, entropy, um, well, I guess really not beginning till the 19th century. Newton didn't have a sense of entropy because he thought that God continually sort of injected um, order into the world, and you know pushed bodies around. Um, but since the 19th century, entropy has been really championed as the final ultimate say about the nature of things, that they tend towards decay. Um, they tend towards loss of organization rather than increase of organization. Now, of course, in the 20th century, the notion of complexity and the notion of evolution, really, on a cosmic scale, was grasped and observed, theoretically grasped and empirically observed. We know that the universe is a time developmental system. It had a beginning, and it has an end, in the sense of a direction, a tendency, a purpose. Even if we just say that that purpose is, or that direction, that tendency, that arrow of time is entropy, we're already working within the conceptual space of teleology. Um, just as when we talk about mechanism, we're thinking in terms of a design paradigm, in the sense that Darwin, in his theory of evolution, and Paley, in his theory of creation, William Paley, a theologian who Darwin studied when he was a university student, they're both working within the same paradigm. Darwin has an external designer, namely capital N, nature, or the natural selector, just as Paley has an intelligent designer, which is capital G, God. Um, and you can say that one is thinking of the universe as designed by intelligence, while the other is thinking of it as designed by something not intelligent. But I think what Darwin is beginning, at least, to uncover in his theory is a different kind of intelligence, ultimately. When he speaks of nature, he doesn't mean Descartes' nature. He doesn't mean mere extension. When Darwin thinks of nature, I think he means to include an aesthetic sense for what nature is. In other words, there's some kind of a purpose at work in the evolution of, well, at least the biosphere. Darwin was still Newtonian at the level of physics, and I think in the 20th century, like I said, the real discovery is cosmological evolution. In other words, the evolutionary theory that is general enough that it actually doesn't respect this boundary between living and non-living systems. The entirety of the universe is an evolutionary process. Certainly the specific details about how that evolutionary process takes place and what inheritance means at each scale of the organizational hierarchy is different, and we should respect those differences. But I think with contemporary, at least 20th century and especially late 20th century uh, evolutionary cosmology and complexity theory, we can no longer think of what had been a disciplinary boundary in the way human beings understand nature as an actual boundary in the way nature is. Nature is, I would argue, nature has no gaps. There's no ontological rifts in nature. There is a sort of a continuous process of emergence, which is a kind of discontinuity, but it's a discontinuity in the context of a more general continuity. There's an emergent evolutionary process where you go from subatomic particles to atoms, to stars and galaxies, to planets with free living cells, to multicellular organisms, to organisms with nervous systems, um, nervous systems that have prefrontal cortexes. And through this gradual process of emergence, what remains continuous ontologically begins to seem more and more discontinuous epistemologically, you could say, or at the level of experience. So that when you get to the human, it really does seem like a difference in degree has become a difference in kind. And that, as the Renaissance Hermeticist Pico de Mirandola thought, the human is that kind for whom kind becomes a problem, for whom kind cannot be unambiguously assigned. The human, in this sense, lacks any predetermined archetypal principle to guide its telos or to provide its soul with some direction. And so the human essence seems to have no essence, or rather to be free to decide one's own essence. And so it's important in the context of the human being, as that special case among all beings, to respect what, for example, language and symbolic material culture, whether it has to do with the printed word or the digital word, that something new and novel has emerged. And all I want to add to this discussion is to say that what is new and novel is not an ontological kind, but a novel form of the same ontological kind. And what that ultimate ontological kind is, I would say, is there are different ways we can get at this. Alfred North Whitehead is kind of my main source here. For him, the final real things of which the world is made are actual occasions, or drops of experience, or self-generating, self-actualizing, concrescent entities that emerge from an inherited past and decide through the realization of a definite characteristics of a future, an anticipated future. And that when we talk about nowness, when we talk about time, which includes, the now includes the past and the future in some strange way, right? I think we have to realize that it's not only human beings that experience time. Human beings may be conscious of time in a new way, and we have to talk about that uh, very special thing, or that very special kind of process, namely consciousness. But we shouldn't think that consciousness is somehow ontologically distinct from and separate from the rest of the universe. We should see that whatever experience is, it transcends merely conscious experience. Conscious experience is a special case of a more general kind of experience, and that experience is so general that it goes all the way down past the level of the first free living cells to any form of organizational unity that exists in nature, whether we're talking about certain molecular accomplishments, whether we're talking about, like crystals, let's say, or whether we're talking about atoms or electrons and photons, whether we're talking about stars and galaxies. We're dealing with a form of organizational unity that is autopoietic, that establishes a boundary between itself and the outside and begins to experience that difference as a sort of stretched present that includes, depending on its degree of complexity, the past and the future. Now, for human beings, who, as far as we know, are at least among the most complex organizational units in the visible world, visible cosmos, for us, the past and the future open up to a tremendous extent, and we augment this capacity, this organic capacity of ours, with external artifacts like clocks and calendars. And in principle, our understanding of the past and the future is infinite. Even if we don't yet know everything about what happened in the past or what might happen in the future, in principle, we can continue to gain insight into both of these domains. Time can continue to cleave into past and future as it at the same time grows together in an ever-widening present. To be human is to be in that strange situation, but to be human is also to be a special case of a more general form of being. And in general, that being, if there is anything at all, it's going to be experiential. It's going to be a sort of agent, an agential process of self-unification. A concrescence, in other words, is Whitehead's neologism for what there is. There are concrescences. The universe itself is a society of concrescences, of actual occasions, emerging from creative potentiality, deciding on some actual way to be, and then being, and then handing themselves off to the next concrescence, which will conformally absorb what has happened in the sense of inheriting it. But to the extent of that new moment of experience, it's to the extent of its own organizational and its organizational capacity, it will experience more deeply what it has inherited, and to the extent that it can begin to reflect on what it has inherited. And I'm describing this journey through evolutionary stages of complexity, from atom to human. Once you get to the human, there is what we would call freedom. And when we talk about the behavior of atoms as they follow gravitational gradients and so on, we don't think of that as, in any sense, a free activity. But it is an activity nonetheless. And we do know for a fact in quantum physics that at the simplest level, at the most microscopic scale, spontaneity is ontologically evident. It's not a matter of a limit of our knowledge. It's a matter of what there is. Or at least that would be my way of interpreting philosophically what quantum physics has shown us scientifically, physically. I was waving this book around before. This is a short, well, not a long essay, let's say, a short book that I've written on Whitehead. It's called Physics of the World Soul, the relevance of Alfred North Whitehead's Philosophy of Organism to Contemporary Scientific Cosmology. And I'm going to post a separate video, sort of an appendix to this one, where I'm going to read just one of the sections of this on Whitehead's imaginative generalization of Darwin's biological theory of evolution, such that it can include the entirety of the physical universe. So that'll be an appendix if you're interested. But um, watch Corey Anton's video if you haven't already, and then give some more thought to what I've said. And I'd enjoy further unpacking these cosmological speculations to see if we might not be able together to arrive at some sort of a consensus, some sort of a shared concrescence or growing together of minds. So, yeah, thanks for listening.